Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our continuing seminar series on ethics and with our famous ethicist, Dr. Arthur Caplan. I'm not going to do a formal introduction because you all know him by now, but you should remember that he's a professor at NYU and he's the head of the Division of Medical Ethics at NYU and a prolific writer. Today, he's going to speak on a topic that is very interesting to all of us. It should be. Does bioethics have a future? And if so, what does it look like? Dr. Kaplan, take it away.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for coming. By the way, I know there's a big group up at Sick Children's in Toronto here today, a big class or group. So shout out to them and my buddy up there, Andrew McFadden. Thank you all for coming in from that institution. Um, I want to assure you that bioethics has a future. We can at least answer the question. So those of you who are just puzzled about that can leave at this point knowing that there is a future. But the question is more whether it's a rosy future, a disturbing future, a future that could be altered, and why would it be disconcerting? But before I get into that, I have to comment on something that's been in the news and is really bothering me, and that is the shooting of this guy from United Healthcare who came to a business meeting in New York and was gunned down, shot in the back in a street outside a New York City hotel. And what is bothering me is not only the vigilante assassination, and it looks like the person who shot him is tied to disaffection with the insurance industry. That seems to be what's going on. I can't say I have complete evidence for that, but clues and media reports point that way. I have no love of American insurance, the way it works. I think it has proven to be inefficient, uh, overly costly, not a guarantee of high quality, poor access. I have many gripes with it. However, I'm bitterly disappointed to see the kind of reaction that has been on Reddit and social media applauding this shooting. Many of the people commenting say they're physicians. I don't know if they are because many of them are anonymous, but it is hateful and nasty and inappropriate to professional ethics in healthcare, to medicine, to nursing, to endorse vigilante murder. Um, you don't have to be a fan of the insurance industry. I'm not. And I wish, and I've said for years, decades, that we should change how we deliver healthcare in this country, seeking a more efficient and less costly and wider access approach. I don't think the market approaches have worked. But to come online publicly and make the public think that the medical profession out of anger is willing to poo-poo or turn aside what happened, I think is just wrong. And it has to be condemned and condemned more loudly by those in medical ethics. It's not acceptable uh, uh, to bolster or support or endorse or in any way excuse what happened. So that said, that's bioethics not speaking up loudly enough, I fear. But let's go to the next slide. So this is just a little disclosure slide. I'm not going to keep it up too long. I don't have any real conflicts about the topic today about bioethics future. And there is a long form disclosure on my website there. If you want to go look and see everything I do and why I do it and what I think about what sort of conflicts it creates. Next slide. So, in understanding the future of bioethics, let's start with where bioethics is today. And there was a recent survey published in the American Journal of Bioethics last September, done by Pearson et al. Good group of bioethicists, very prominent people in the field, good scholars. And they conducted a survey to try and understand what are the backgrounds and views, practices, and policy thoughts of bioethicists. They surveyed 824 bioethicists, some at the American Society of Bioethics and Humanities annual meeting. Some they interviewed who had professional appointments as medical ethicists, bioethicists at schools, academic bioethicists. And it's a mixed group. There are philosophers, lawyers, doctors. I think a few nurses are in there as people identified either doing primarily bioethics work or exclusively bioethics work. And I'm going to say this is a very timely survey in light of thinking about where things are going. I'm glad it got done. It's the first empirical snapshot of bioethics, and it both reveals what I'm going to call attributes of the current establishment in bioethics, also reveals what I'm going to call uh, alternative approaches to bioethics that have been flourishing for decades, but not really capturing the attention of the establishment. So they found, for example, that bioethicists' views don't really align with those of the US public. For example, the people they surveyed are more likely than members of the public to think abortion is ethically permissible. I'm not even talking about legally, but they are less likely to believe than the establishment bioethicists that compensation for organ donation is ethical. And give me the next slide. I think we'll get a little snapshot here. Yeah, give me the next one. I think we can skip this. So again, this is who they talked to both at the meeting and at the centers. It's a pretty good broad snapshot. Next one. So they found out that bioethics primarily is still white, male-led, liberal, left-wing, progressive orientation, not really coming from religious points of view that is tied to religious traditions in how they do their thinking, in how they do their analysis. It's fairly ableist, meaning there is not a lot of disability represented in the ranks of bioethicists. And as I said already, it's out of step with a lot of widely held popular views in American society, as shown by other surveys, but I also might add, as shown by the recent election, about bioethical issues. The election absolutely confirms that. And in fact, I didn't really need the survey. This is where I sometimes jump off the empirical bandwagon that increasingly dominates bioethics work. I know what this field looks like. All I have to do is go to the meeting, look around the convention, look at the program, and I could get the same finding as the survey did. But for those of you who like surveys to prove things and empirical data to prove things, they got it. Next slide. Now, the problem to begin with in trying to predict the future is our understanding of what's current. It's valuable to have this data, but if you just look at academic or establishment bioethics, what I fear is we continue to ignore a vast group of people that are both influencing the new administration and social debates, both nationally and in many states, about bioethical issues, and are absolutely going to continue to do so in the Trump administration. That is to say, there is a bioethics establishment. It runs the academic programs. It dominates the professional meetings. But for at least a couple of decades, there have been alternate movements promoting bioethical thought, inquiry, publication, and policy that the establishment has not paid attention to very much. If I went to a regional or national meeting, for example, of those bioethicists who work at Catholic universities and schools and their affiliated hospitals, or for that matter, evangelical colleges, I would get a very different view of what bioethics looks like. And for sure, if I went to a meeting at the enormous number of right-wing institutes, think tanks, and policy shops, think Cato, Heritage, Hoover, American Enterprise, Manhattan Institute, and there are many, many more, I would encounter very well-funded organizations whose domain often includes bioethics And they're very different in orientation, makeup, ideology, and professional affiliation from those that got surveyed connected to the ASBH and the academic programs by Pearson. There are really two worlds of bioethics. Three worlds of bioethics. One is the establishment, and most doctors, most people affiliated with academic institutions and healthcare know that world. They may not like it, they may agree with it, they may be part of it, but that's the world they know. But out on a different path for many years have been those with strong religious affiliations, whether they're Catholic, evangelical, Seventh-day Adventist is another group that has a very strong bioethics work that is connected explicitly to the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And they have their own meetings, and they have their own publications, and they put out their own writings and statements on many, many issues, not well engaged with, often completely independent from the bioethics establishment, but not lacking in influence. Similarly, all those right-wing think tanks that have been set up to shape policy over at least the past 2 decades, many of their number are moving into positions in the Trump administration where they will have great influence over medical ethics and bioethical thought. That is people who would be frequently invited, like, Joe Lopato or Jay Bhattacharya from Hoover. These are people who have been maybe not writing in the quote unquote bioethics journals and maybe never sought tenure in a bioethics division or department, but nevertheless have been writing op-ed pieces, have been shaping thought among certainly Trump circles, conservative circles, Republican circles for many, many, many years. And again, I'll tell you that if you're trying to predict the future, you can't do a little bit what the survey did at the ASBH meetings and so on and generalize from just that segment. The picture is very different than that snapshot survey reveals, and it's one that is going to influence what the future looks like. Next slide. That network has been flourishing with the think tank crowd, supported by white men, urban billionaires. They wouldn't invite most ASBH members in for coffee. They don't want to hear from them. They don't like them. They don't support them. Yet these networks are rich sources of input for training. Many people in the Federalist Society who've become judges have been through these think tanks, exposed to bioethical positions and thinking in those settings. And they shape policy in courts. They teach and mentor others who move into, I'm going to call it bioethics issues. And through what is known as Project 2025, as that gets implemented, they're going to do so for many, many years to come. And I'm going to say it again. Establishment academic bioethics has more or less remained oblivious to the growth, power, influence of both the religious grounded bioethics community and the conservative or Trump oriented policy world of bioethical thought. Next slide. Actually, bioethics has had these splits for a long time. It fractured into left and right years ago, decades ago. My friend Jonathan Moreno has written a book about this way back in 2011. The fracture became very obvious, not when Trump got elected for the second time, but with the election of George W. Bush. He appointed the President's Council on Bioethics, some will remember, to advise his administration, and it replaced the Clinton Bioethics Advisory Commission. And Clinton's group absolutely leaned heavily to the left, was made up of establishment bioethicists, spent a lot of time worrying about violations of dignity and rights in American medicine, and was staffed by academics not only from the establishment, but from elite institutions within the bioethics establishment. The Bush Council was accused by some academic bioethicists, me, among them, of being composed of largely Christian-affiliated neoconservatives, philosophers, and political scientists. And by the way, it was. The conservative side of bioethics came out and since then has operated in its own world, fueled by heavy investment by right-wing wealthy people who want to see their ideas and thinking advanced. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with that. It's entirely within the rights of Americans to support think tanks or entities that they think advance sound ethical discussion. I'm not even trying to argue that just because it's neoconservative or Trumpite, it's inherently wrong. What I am saying is sociologically, these are forces that are going to shape the future that have been underappreciated by the establishment in bioethics. Next slide. The culture war, as it's known sometimes, broke out in bioethics 25 years ago and it's just escalating under the specter of a return of Trump. The survey reveals that rift between academic bioethics and the general public. However, that rift reflects a broader rift in American society and moral life, including the isolation, if you will, of a lot of the thinkers who are more conservative into their own networks, into their own political movement. So measuring who shows up at the ASBH to get a snapshot of what bioethics is like is sort of like surveying people at the Democratic National Convention to see what political views dominate America. You're not going to get an accurate view, although who's there at the Democratic National Convention might be interesting. And again, I'm not saying the ASBH survey isn't interesting, but huge swaths of American society in American bioethical thinking, even in public or on the internet, have long been moving in a different direction, not captured in the survey whatsoever. Next slide. So bioethics needs to, first of all, just acknowledge that there are competitive alternative worldviews that are out there. They don't tilt liberal left. They're not urbane, attached to fancy academic schools, prestigious places. They probably are still dominated by white male perspectives and leadership. These alternative strains in bioethics, particularly wealthy people. Pearson and the survey people looked at the snapshot survey they did of the establishment and said, well, the conclusion is we got to be more inclusive and less privileged and less male dominated, more diversity. That's what the field needs. My conclusion is, sure, I think we need more diversity. Academic establishment bioethics is still very male dominated. Granted, it looks pretty white, although it certainly is becoming more gender balanced. There are women and people who are gay, LGBT coming in more, but nonetheless, it skews left and secular. And my view is adding more diversity to the ranks of the establishment doesn't drastically change the outlook and values that one's going to need if we're really going to engage with the broad sector of American bioethics thinking. You might conclude that to bridge that gap, we have to reach out more to non-academic people who are working in the think tanks, connect more to the religious dialogue, try to find people to bring into the establishment who come from rural backgrounds. Most people in bioethics do not. And they bring what I'll call urban or urbane values in, more people who are happy and proud to engage with religious traditions as they try to analyze bioethical dilemmas, just adding more people from the ranks of minorities or adding more people who are more diverse in terms of, let's say, disability to the establishment is not the solution to where bioethics is heading fast. Next one. So we're going to have some pretty big change coming up into the future. I think what I want to say here is, what are these changes? Well, first of all, it is clear that many Americans and those who elected Trump and the Congress and supported indirectly the Supreme Court composition as it is, believe that fundamental reproductive rights can be tamped down in the name of protecting embryonic and fetal life. There is a pro-life strain that is sometimes linked to religious views, sometimes linked to just respect for local decision making, as Trump would put it, states' rights, community rights, and that is going to be one strain of thinking that is going to have to be in dialogue as the new administration comes in. Secondly, the new administration is not so interested in what goes on overseas. They came out of COVID very angry with pandemic activities by federal agencies. They thought that there was a cover-up of how COVID began. I'm looking for hearings on how did we ignore the fact that NIH funding supported research in Wuhan that led to a lab accident that led to COVID. I don't happen to believe that story at all. I think the evidence points pretty strongly toward wet market transmission to humans. Whether that's what I believe or not doesn't much matter. We can expect a pretty vicious set of hearings and examinations. Congress has already issued the majority a report saying it's coming to look at complicity with gain of function research and working with foreign entities that put us at risk. That says less working with foreign entities. It says to me, even programs like Fogarty at the NIH are going to get a really close examination. Why are we spending money on issues overseas, trying to understand phenomena overseas? I think that requires ethical engagement. It may be, the answer is quite simple. It's in our self-interest to intercept early threats to our public health. You don't have to get into equity arguments or justice arguments. You can make them also in terms of self-interest, but that is coming. You can be sure that even programs like the ELSI program and ethics work that has been supported by the NIH is going to get a long, hard look. And if science is also getting somewhat limited in its budgets, areas like public health, areas like infectious disease starting to be cut back, that will mean reprioritization, and ethics comes at the end of the line. To put it bluntly, if science is not getting funded, there isn't much money left over to fund the ethics of the science. And I would very much worry whether it's cutting back on overhead in US grantsmanship or simply just flattening or cutting back the overall budget for the NIH, that we're going to see reverberations there. Current administration hates regulation. FDA appointments and FDA policy, I think, will be shifting to allow more risk and more choice by participants in research in what they want to be exposed to. Here's a weird reality. Some of the strongest allies for maintaining evidence-based science in drug and vaccine and device development probably will turn out to be industry, which doesn't want to be left in competition with unregulated and often strange evidence bases, touting all manner of cures and remedies and notions and nostrums and kooky interventions. Think goop, think wellness. If RFK Jr. goes in there, he's certainly a person who is not fond of fluoridation, but likes raw milk. He's certainly a person who wants to swing to prevention and change the American diet to be more nutritious. Okay, that's going to need discussion about how that happens and what is actually meant. If you really tried to switch us to organic foods completely, people who didn't like the price of eggs before Trump got election aren't going to like it afterwards, because that's about 25% more expensive to do, and it certainly isn't going to happen overnight. In any event, what I'm pointing at more is not so much, again, the rightness or wrongness, but changes fundamentally in how the health establishment is going to be engaging with public health issues, infectious disease issues, therapy versus prevention, the value of basic research, what it thinks about the establishment bioethics, progressive and lefty, in terms of whether that is worth supporting, and preparing for a world in which that change, and if I'm wrong, good, but I don't think I am, but at least preparing for that to happen. Next slide. So one way to respond in the immediate future, internationalize the community of academic bioethicists. That's the fastest way to grow diversity. It's not by trying to hire in people and let them go up through postdocs and get tenure. That'll make it more diverse in about 7 years. What we need is to make sure we're listening to people from other cultures, other nations, other places, that they're actively involved in our dialogue. Inside baseball here, some of you know there was protest at holding the last international bioethics meeting in Qatar. People said that's a repressive regime and it has values that are not liberal toward fundamental human rights. My written view was you must engage, you must debate, we need dialogue, different religious traditions, people who aren't secular, even sometimes things we bitterly oppose. If they're willing to talk, we have to be willing to engage. If the invitation goes out to come and speak and say what you want, then that is the way to get diversity rapidly into bioethics, and we must do that. Bioethics research has to commit to dissemination of results and communication to non-academic audiences. This is, and I've written about this too recently, one thing the survey reveals is if you're going to do bioethics, then you better figure out ways to break out, engage in dialogue with bigger audiences than other bioethicists. Got to stop talking just to ourselves. I mean, I've spent a lot of my career, sometimes getting in trouble, trying to bring bioethics out to the public. Not every academic bioethicist thought that was a great idea. And actually, some of the public that I was talking to didn't think it was a great idea either because they didn't want to hear what I had to say. But whether that's good or bad, it is something we must do. We have to find ways to engage beyond the academic silo. And let me add, there is no credit given whatsoever for doing this within academia. And I'm going to extend the comment to all science and medical research work. If you don't find ways to present what you're doing and why you're doing it to the general public, if the public continues to think that science and medical research gets done in hidden ivory towers by strange nerds that they can't relate to, then they're not going to support it. And you're going to see the environment created whereby nonsense stories like gain of function research in China being responsible for COVID flourish. That tells me they don't understand, they don't trust, they don't see what's going on. So the critique of being in a bubble or an ivory tower, some effort has to be made to encourage ability to communicate to the public, train people to do it, credit the work when it gets done. If it doesn't happen, the outsiders who don't trust us are going to take a toll on us. Failing to engage policy and know what the public is thinking, that's like saying, I'm going to give you a concrete example. You know, I've been around the field long enough. I see Ollie Fine is here. He can testify. I've been around about 100 years. I think Ollie and I were talking bioethics when I was 12. But in any event, if you watch Trump promulgate eugenics day after day in his campaign, disparaging minorities, insulting people and saying they were poisoning our blood, using rhetoric that I haven't really seen that loudly since the American eugenics movement or German race hygiene, and drawing no response from medicine and science of much significance about the bogus nature of eugenics, which helped this guy get elected by stirring fear of immigration and minorities. That is an utter failure. We have the ELSI program looking at genetics funded for 25 years, and that's fiddling while eugenics is out there burning. I mean, what is the point of having a program assessing the ethics of genetic testing, genetic engineering, all of the things that the ELSI program does, and having an ample literature and many great experts, if you've got a national candidate spewing eugenics with no response. Next one. We have to force attention to healthcare more broadly. If this guy gets shot in the back in the street for representing an insurance company, then arguing just only about who gets a ventilator in a pandemic, which I did and was something that had to be done, or who's going to get a rare face transplant, which I do, and it's something that has to be done, but that's all individual trees. We do have to engage equity and justice, but we have to engage it in what's wrong with the American healthcare system more loudly. There are plenty of angry doctors, plenty of angry providers, plenty of angry patients, plenty of discontent, and bioethics, in my opinion, has not paid enough attention to the blatantly obvious failure of the healthcare system we've got to address the needs and access obstacles of the American healthcare system, to not pay attention to other countries and what works well and what doesn't, and the anger of so many providers, not always in academic settings, but out in the world, about having their healthcare second guessed by third parties with no qualifications, sometimes even a chatbot saying no, having to spend forever dealing with these entities to gain independence and clinical security in making their recommendations and trying to get the treatments they think is best. I think that if you don't move in that direction and attend to those problems, you're not capturing what many Americans are so angry about, as indicated by this unacceptable, terrible response to this assassination. Assassination support, an assassination, drivel. I know social media is full of that kind of drivel, and you can do it when you're anonymous and people mouth off and say all kinds of stupid things. But you don't remain silent when that happens. And you certainly don't ignore the source of that huge emotional backlash. And it comes on the provider, doctor side, on the healthcare side, and it's on the patient side. So whatever the anger is, we have a duty as people concerned about ethics to just get away sometimes from the bedside. And again, I'm at the bedside and I'm looking at high-tech, innovative technologies and the ethics of same. But you got to spend some time thinking about the nursing home and what's going on there, home care and what goes on there, how the system is allowing equity, venture capital to take over huge swaths of healthcare like ophthalmology, reproductive services, dermatology, how healthcare has been turned into a business, and medical ethics and professional ethics are weakening as business ethos begins to replace medical ethics, to be blunt about it. And that is a system problem and a health policy problem, and it isn't solved by wondering either about face transplants or whether or not there's enough vaccine supply that's going to the third world in the middle of an mpox outbreak. All important, but not enough. Just not enough. And the younger generation, I believe, has to pay attention to that. And by the way, the failings of the NHS, the failings of the Canadian healthcare system, it's not like these are some kind of nirvanas. I'm well aware of the critics and problems there, but I don't see the bioethics voices speaking up, suggesting alternatives, laying out fundamental things. I mean, let me just give you one basic lack. There is no right to healthcare in America. There hasn't been since the founding of the country. Why? Isn't it something that we should say, this is where we begin, a right to basic healthcare, maybe not a face transplant, but something on the level of what the VA has been delivering, and everybody should get it. And that's what we hold politicians' feet to the fire for, is to get them adequate basic healthcare as a right, not something they earn through work, not something they deserve because they are employed. That's the American context. but a fundamental human right because you can't compete in the market without health, and children and people with disabilities need to be brought up to a level of basic functioning in order to compete in capitalist society. Appeal to where the thinking is, sometimes on the conservative side. Let me add one other gripe, and then we can maybe move over to some questions, a gripe about managing the future. Dr. McNutt, the president of the National Academy of Sciences and Medicine, recently issued a statement which drove me crazy. She said, in looking forward about the role of science in the coming administration, it should be kept in mind that science is value neutral, that what scientists do is pursue the facts, that what science's job is to come up with evidence and factual information, report that to policy people, people in positions of authority and power, and let them use it to make decisions going forward about the health of Americans, the welfare of Americans, climate change, pollution, whatever the public policy issue is. I'm going to say flat out, I think that is absolutely wrong. I know partly it's wrong because if you work in a cognate field like I do, the history and philosophy of science, you learn very quickly that science is not value free. Science is always a product of its time, its culture, its context, the issues that are identified as important to work on, the priorities given for research are very much a product of values. Having the NIH enthusiastically map the genome and move toward a better understanding of the genetic basis of disease is a value judgment. When I was a college student, no one paid any attention to the genetic basis of disease. They paid attention to the environmental causes of health and ill health. That is to say, conditioning. That is to say, the lord of the day was B.F. Skinner, and people were very much worried about what the environmental impact or learning impact was on health. As the genome was mapped, we shifted toward genetic reductionism. I'm not saying it's wrong or right. I'm just saying it's a value decision to turn away from one set of causes of ill health and intervention to another. We clearly have an emphasis in our culture on rescue and therapy, not prevention. It's a value judgment as to what people want to do and what they're willing to do to change their lifestyle and so on. Moreover, science, healthcare, bioethics must speak up and get engaged with political policy and value issues. They're citizens. Their expertise isn't just here's the facts and moving on. It is to say, here's the facts, and this is what seems to be the consequences of these facts for thinking about policy. So if you're studying climate change and things keep going up 2 degrees a year, I don't think it's responsible just to say temperature around the world is increasing in the oceans 2 degrees per year. Do with it as you wish. Somebody's going to need to hear that that's not good for the fish, or that's bad for melting ice, or it isn't going to be good for coastal cities, and on and on. You don't simply stop with respect to Dr. McNutt with supplying the facts. The worst illustration of this in history is when the doctors were put on trial at Nuremberg for their research atrocities in the camps. And one of the things they tried to plead was they're just scientists. They don't determine what to do. They're told what to do by the government in terms of their research, and they just present the findings to the people who are the politicians and the authorities and let them apply their work, whether it's in the Luftwaffe or other outlets of the German government to apply findings about hypothermia or decompression or burns or wounds. It's not up to us to say, they said, what to do with it. And it's not up to us to say even how we do our research. We are just scientists. And the judges listened to this and rejected it and said, that is not true. Scientists have to have values. They have to stand up when government tells them to do things that are abhorrent and immoral. They should not do that. Government has to take steps to protect people involved in research. That was the then Nuremberg Code, which became the Helsinki Code of Ethics. And scientists are responsible for giving advice to policymakers that carries normative weight. If you think it's wrong to do something, then you should say it's wrong to do something. And I believe that. And I don't think people today should succumb to this notion. Those of you with a philosophy bent, it's called logical positivism. There's no values in science. I think we've got a lot of scholarship in the history of science that proves that's wrong. And we have a lot of scholarship that shows you get into big trouble when scientists, doctors, even the bioethicists simply say, well, these are our facts, these are our findings. We throw them out there in our publications, and then we wait for the world to do with them as they will. You detect climate danger, pollution that puts people's health at risk, abandonment of vaccination policies that can lead to children's deaths, then you don't just say, here's the facts about vaccines. You say we better do something to enhance vaccination or slow climate change or re-engineer how we're dealing with agriculture and commercial manufacturing. I personally do not believe that a value-free science, medicine, and bioethics is the proper position. That is being debated, and it needs some engagement from the bioethics community about its stance, and those in science and medicine who are engaged in areas where obviously policy implications are more at the forefront of the work that they do. So to sum up, bioethics word is now actually has an establishment, but the establishment got a very rude awakening in the recent election because more powerful entities influencing and reflecting different value orientations got a better support, found more support in the American people who elected an administration committed to a series of values that are not those, I would agree with Pearson there, that are dominant within the bioethics establishment. Does the establishment have paths and roads for engagement with these other ways of seeing bioethical issues and dialoguing with them? Not sufficiently. We should look to create them, look to try and debate, dialogue, and so on. If you look at where we were in the past, that schism has been around for a long time. It just got ignored. It didn't just happen with Trump. It goes all the way back to the George W. Bush administration, where people started to retreat into their bubbles and dialogue was not going on, and it hasn't been, and it eventuated in this very, in my opinion, unfortunate split without adequate engagement. If we look at where things are going to go, the values that people are bringing into the new administration in the health and science space are not those that are held as valid by the bioethics establishment and many in the more general health and science establishment. Those have to be engaged. I don't think the road to the future is to withdraw like a turtle into our shells and say, we're just neutral, keep funding us, we don't disturb anybody, we don't bother anybody, we're just here finding the facts, so leave us alone. A, I don't think it's true, and B, I don't think it serves the American people or international interests for that matter in terms of what's best going forward. So I still believe in a more activist stance, and I also believe that we have to engage at broader levels than simply bedside clinical ethics or simply research ethics, watching innovative new technologies. There's a big forest out there with an angry public in America about a crummy, inadequate, frustrating healthcare system. You can see it in the terrible reaction to the event in New York. That's signaling where bioethics needs to be going. So I'll stop there and see if I left some time for questions or comments or disagreement for that matter.
I have a question. First of all, is it okay to jump in?
Sure.
But
Uh,
Good to see you again. It's been a long
hey,
time.
how are you?
Um, you began your presentation today by stating that bioethics will survive, but you didn't really point out what form it'll survive in. Uh, in my crude understanding of these issues, bioethics was rather, one time was monolithic. And as you point out, Tuskegee, Nuremberg, animal rights, these are all driving forces in our society that there was large agreement about. As you move towards your proposed inclusion of the underrepresented, the world, as you point out, is dichotomized, trichotomized, it's split. Our society is split. So what are we moving towards? Do you anticipate multiple bioethical standards? What does the future hold? It seems that we're not readily going to achieve any kind of reestablishment of this monolithic approach to bioethics. It has to be divided. So what will this divided profile look like when it works?
So, thanks for that. Uh, I'll try to be clear. I think we're at a point where the establishment and its way of thinking is moving into a minority point of view with key government at the federal level actors. Bioethics will have a future, but it will be the conservative, more libertarian, and more MAGA-like future at the federal level. There may be ways to blunt that by opening lines of communication, both internationally and nationally, to these other thinkers that are driving MAGA positions on public health, healthcare, and the health system. So it's not like these guys woke up out of a coma and just had views. They have their own ethicists, to put it that way. And we have to engage with those ethicists to try and modify or balance more where they're going. Otherwise, bioethics future will be with an establishment that is speaking in a minority voice. As many people know, the minority voice does get heard in some parts of the US. I live in Connecticut. You can still have bioethical discourse with the health department and the governor and all that locally. It's a blue state. It'll listen to the more progressive ideas, but that is not the future I think is best, to have sort of a division of that nature. The other is, if we try to handle this change in our future by withdrawing away from policy, away from trying to communicate to the public, away from trying to establish our bona fides outside academic circles, then I think we risk having a very limited future for the establishment. Very limited. It can exist as a boutique thing. It'll be like Hittite studies. Interesting if you want to know about that culture, but probably not, commanding much attention outside a scholarly meeting or two. That's not a good future, but it looms if all you do is build an academic bioethics establishment and you don't introduce it into the public sphere. So maybe that makes it it's not necessarily optimistic, but maybe that's a little clearer about where I think things may go. Yeah, who else we got there? You want to take them in the chat box, or you want to let them talk? I don't care.
Dr. Caplan, um, talking about ethics and the elite institutions, what we learned was always towards the left. And there was never any ability to discuss any other form of ethics. And as you said, ethics is in different hubs throughout the country. So it was never an inclusive thing where you all got together and tried, as you said, to work things out. So what is known and what is taught, and the way you say it, if you take on a fellow, no matter how diverse they are, we're going to learn that ethics. And so I agree with you. This is where the error is. And this was the error in the cancel culture that came out with the Democrats canceling out the American people so that they were furious about other things. And so all of a sudden the country turns red. Why? Just what you said, because they're reacting against being left out of every single aspect of academic thought. And that goes into birth control, it goes into transsexuality, all that. And nobody speaks out on the ethics side, nobody speaks out on the medical side, nobody speaks out. And yet the American public is left there to get angry and upset and confused.
Well,
So,
here's a thought experiment, which I only have as a thought experiment, but I wonder if we pulled out top 10 topics published upon in, say, the 2 or 3 main bioethics journals, AJOB, Hastings, JME, just picking them out of the air, and saw what the overlap was between the topics that people write on. And I'm going to say the number one concern of the American public right now, which is a broken healthcare system that leaves them ready to applaud killing the head of the insurance company.
no, that's just,
So I suspect they're not aligned. And again, look, I spent a lot of my career on focused technical academic research issues, but I've always tried to write about nursing homes, home care questions, chronic illness, other things in addition. And I spent a lot of my career trying to bring bioethics into the public to engage. That means that part of my career has just been lonely because there aren't a lot of people doing it. And you squawk about it. And more to the point, if I told a young person, spend 5% of your time writing opinion pieces or go local and give some talks at a church or a 4-H club or Kiwanis or Rotary or something like that, that's 5% less of a chance they have to get promoted. Now, if you want to hold to those values, you can. To come back to what Moni asked about, if that's the academic position and what it wants its bioethicists to do to advance, or for that matter, scientists and doctors who, with whatever views, try to reach out beyond peers, then I say the future's not bright. Not bright.
they're not doing it. It's not happening. I
By the
mean,
way,
we are a big force for
this
doing
kind of
good.
ranting talk you can only give when you're really lurching up toward retirement. I just want to make that very clear.
That's right.
Art,
Otherwise you wouldn't get promoted.
Exactly.
Art, I'm wondering if part of the lack of speaking up about some of these much more fundamental issues in our society has to do with a sense that bioethicists want to have an impact on the world. And, from what you're saying, yes, this is one way to have an important impact on the world. But in American society, we've been having conversations about, changing our health and, whether health insurances are right or not. And there's been multiple efforts at healthcare reform that have failed. And so I could see bioethicists thinking, is this really a good use of my time? Am I going to really be able to affect change here? Because we've tried and we've been having these conversations over and over again to no avail.
Yeah, just two quick comments there. One, I think that there are conversations that amazingly have been relatively ethics free. They're had by economists, they're fought out by people on the health policy front. Certainly a lot of discussion you went to publications like Health Affairs or Milbank or other places like that, you'll see discussions, but you don't see the ethics voices engaged there. I said earlier, if you begin with the premise that there ought to be a fundamental right to healthcare for every American, and here's why, and here's my argument for that, that should then ground all the subsequent discussion as a commitment to that. But I don't see that. I just don't see it. It's not, we don't have a framework that says, here's what the commitment ought to be morally for access. And then move on to say, well, what are your ideas about what best serves that? What system or approaches? And what can we learn from other places that have made that commitment in terms of what's working or failing? Is there a lot of rationing in the National Health Service? what's the wait time and kin. I get all the issues, but let's look at it from that point of view. And then, sorry to jump in there, Lisa, but the other thing I was going to say is, even if it's frustrating as hell, nobody gave up on talking about living wills for 35 years. And I'm not sure they've ever worked. And we're still babbling on about them. So suck it up is part of my answer.
Well, I don't know. I'd love for us to figure out a better a way to become more relevant. I mean, I completely agree that these are the fundamental issues that we should be contributing to, and that we need more public discussion and debate, and need to be able to persuade our society. But for some reason, we haven't been able.
So let me, again, I'm watching the time a little bit here. I know, as fascinating as this is, people are going to have to get out of here. So, one, start to get rewards for doing it inside the academic system. You got to make it explicit. Anybody ever get rewarded for peer review? No.
No.
Is peer review falling apart? Yes. It's not a priority for anybody to do it. It's a public service that they do, a few noble souls. You want to improve peer review, credit it. You want to improve public policy impact, public communication, broadening to wider audiences. In my career, I've sat on plenty of promotion committees, lots. You know how often that's come up? Never. Zero. You want to get change on public policy? Make allies with agents and entities that are shaping it. And that includes industry, foundations, other groups. I hinted at this, and it may sound crazy to some of you. The best friend you're going to have in trying to defend regulation and safety in drug development is the drug industry. They don't want to sail out there with a bunch of quacks equally competing against legitimate products. And you can say whatever you want about their prices and their, I get all that, but it's an industry that long ago committed to ethical pharmaceuticals. If you look at the history, it was in, opposition to guys on wagons selling alcohol under the name of some nostrum. And I could go on with this, but you look for your allies that have the levers of power. You don't disparage them. You don't say you can't work on vaccines with the vaccine industry. That's crazy. It's craziness. Of course you have to work with them. They control what the vaccine's supply is, where it's going, and all of that. I didn't say I have to excuse everything. I'm laughing because I see Ron Kroll is out there. He knows when he was at Glaxo, I would yell at him about a whole host of things and say the whole industry was half-assed corrupt. But sometimes you get a change that's good for the people and the public and advances public health, and you take it. This is not, I'm not arguing for Lenin waiting for utopia to come so we can have the mass revolution and the equality of peoples. I'll take little victories. Let's get practical about policy here for what we've got in store coming, immediately down the road. So anyway, more thoughts about that. Can I make a request, Sean, or somebody? Can you capture for me the comments that are in the chat box? There's about 2 million of them in there, and I haven't gotten to see them, and I would like to, if you can save them and send them to me. I don't know if that's possible, but I'd like to see them. Also, before I let you all out of here, if you didn't get to ask me something or you have thoughts, please do email me. I'm very interested, as long as I'm either playing the role of Delphic Oracle or some half-drugged prophet on a mountaintop. I'm very interested in feedback about these ideas. And, I don't claim that I know they're right. I'm just giving you a slant from a particular perspective, but I really would value feedback or comments about all this. It won't be the last time I get a chance to talk about it. I'm going to tell you one other funny thing before I go. People said, how do you know that you have a path to communicate with people in other bubbles? Well, weirdly, I know I have a path because 2 or 3 of them that are prominent are my students. Now, you might say you trained them pretty poorly, depending on your point of view, I know where they are and I can talk to them and, do my best to sort of say, let's not all get rid of fluoride in the water, or maybe it's a little bad idea to get after seed oils. They did replace lard and butter. That's kind of a little advancement in your cardiac health there. You don't want to lose your mind so much. And you may have connections, students, friends, family members. That's how you build outreach too. You sort of look to see what path you can tap or go down. So it's just something to think about. When you see me showing up on Newsmax or Fox News, just remember he's trying to do a little reach out. He's not there to advance necessarily their thinking. All right. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Dr.
Hopefully you got some
Caplan.
pot
That's
stirring out of
stunning.
that.
Yeah, we'll hope to see you again very soon. It was a stunning presentation, helping us to think out of the box and to think broadly about what's happening.
Very good.
See
Thanks, everybody.
you soon. Stay well. Have a good vacation. Bye.